shipping routes of Asia. Nearly 7 decades later, the founding father of the United States Air Force, Billy Mitchell, declared in testimony to Congress, and I quote, "I believe that in the future, whoever controls Alaska controls the world. I think it is the most strategic place in the world," end quote. Mitchell's vision for the eventual 49th state proved shrewd. The United States Air Force based early warning radar stations, long-range bombers, and missile defense capabilities in Alaska during the Cold War due to its proximity to the Soviet Union. Passenger airlines also utilized Alaska as the global hub, so planes from Western Europe, East Asia, and North America could avoid traveling through restricted Soviet airspace. Today, nearly 150 years since the purchase of Alaska, the world has changed dramatically. Not surprisingly, though, the Alaskan Arctic remains strategically vital to the United States. The airspace in Alaska is the United States' first line of defense against intrusions by aircraft or missiles, as was brazenly reminded earlier this year with the surveillance balloon. U.S. military forces based in Alaska stand ready to deploy quickly to any theater of operations in the world, from Eastern Europe and the Middle East to the Western Pacific. As the sea ice recedes and the waters of the Arctic Ocean become traversable for longer stretches of the year, civilian and military maritime traffic has increased. This trend will only make Alaska even more strategically important to the United States, as Alaska lies at the confluence of the 2 major shipping routes through the Arctic to East Asia, the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage. Our geopolitical adversaries recognize that control of the Arctic region is essential. Russia, which has the most territory and largest Arctic population, maintains a robust military presence in the region. Russia has 6 icebreakers. The United States currently has 2. Russia's proximity to Alaska makes its concentration of forces appear even more menacing. The Russian mainland lies less than 60 miles away from the west coast of Alaska. Additionally, just 2.4 miles separate the Russian island of Diomede and the American island of Little Diomede in the Bering Strait. To make matters worse, the People's Republic of China has absurdly claimed itself to be, quote, a near-Arctic state, and is attempting to impose its will through diplomatic pressure and increasing maritime transits by PRC vessels in Arctic waters. The PRC is also actively building out its own icebreaker fleet, and its 2 existing icebreakers have operated in both the Arctic and Antarctic regions. Therefore, the United States must prioritize the Arctic as a region of national importance and one that is vital to our homeland security. And this committee has a crucial role to play in securing our strategic interests in the Arctic. The United States Coast Guard has operated in Alaska since the United States purchased the state. Today, with its icebreaker fleet and assets based around Alaska, the Coast Guard is a critical component of the U.S. national security posture in the Arctic, performing search and rescue operations in our austere environments and enforcing U.S. laws in our waters off the coast of Alaska. As maritime traffic increases, we must ensure that the Coast Guard maintains the ability to protect our coastline, enforce our laws, and save lives at sea. The Department of Homeland Security has a responsibility to protect our transportation sector and critical infrastructure from physical and cyber threats. Alaska hosts a multitude of important military bases and critical infrastructure sites such as the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the Port of Alaska, and Ted Stevens International Airport, in addition to several military installations in Alaska and critical undersea cables connecting Alaska to the continental U.S. It is vital that the Department of Homeland Security work to deter potential attacks or attempts by adversaries to degrade or disrupt the operations of this critical infrastructure. Secretary Seward, Senator Sumner, and Colonel Mitchell recognize the enormous potential of Alaska in their time. We must not lose sight of their prescient vision in our time. I thank our witnesses for appearing before the committee today, and I look forward to their testimonies. The purpose of course, our hearing today, as I said, is to address the issues of opportunity and threat that the Arctic region poses. I'm going to defer the ranking member's statements until he arrives, And I would now like to introduce our distinguished panel of witnesses. Questions by members on the dais will be reserved for the witnesses on the second panel after the opening statement from our first panel. Senator Dan Sullivan has represented the state of Alaska since 2015. Senator, thank you for being here today, and I now recognize you for 5 minutes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson. I'm very honored to be able to testify on this important hearing on the Arctic and Arctic strategy. And I commend the committee. To your point, Mr. Chairman, there's a lot going on in the world, but we got to keep our eye on all strategic areas of the globe and America's interests. So I commend the committee for undertaking this hearing to understand the complexities of Arctic security and providing me an opportunity to talk about the increasing significance of the Arctic region to our nation's security. The Arctic, as you mentioned in your excellent opening statement, and by the way, you're going to hear some repetition here because I think it was so good, but the Arctic is undergoing monumental changes. Sea ice is receding, opening an entire ocean that was previously unreachable. This allows access to a wealth of natural resources and makes available maritime trade routes that are thousands of nautical miles shorter than transits using the Suez Canal or Panama Canal. The strategic importance of this region, the Arctic, is unquestionable. Arctic security is American security. Despite that, we as a country are not properly postured to secure our vital national interests in this region. America is an Arctic nation because of Alaska. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciated a little bit of the history on my great state. By the way, $7.2 million, probably the best real estate deal in the history of America. Maybe the Louisiana Purchase, but they're both close. 2 cents an acre. My state is at the forefront of Arctic competition and guards the United States against threats from our competitors. We all know, and you mentioned it, Mr. Chairman, we are in a new era of authoritarian aggression led by the dictators Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. They are running hostile regimes that seek to control access to the Arctic region and, importantly and dangerously, are increasingly working together in the Arctic. Alaska's proximity to both Russia and China requires that my state play a vital role in securing America's interests in the Arctic. You mentioned Billy Mitchell. I never tire. My colleagues on the Armed Services Committee get a little bit tired of the quote, but I'll say it again since you already said it. Billy Mitchell referred to in a hearing in the Congress as Alaska is the most strategic place in the world. Fortunately, we have undertaken a military build-up there that needs to continue. Right now, Alaska constitutes 3 pillars of America's military might. We are the cornerstone of missile defense for the entire country. All the radar systems and all the ground-based missile interceptors are based in Alaska, protecting every city in the United States. We are the hub of air combat power for the Arctic in the Indo-PACOM region. For example, we have over 100 fifth-generation fighters located in Alaska, F-22s and F-35s. There's no place on the planet Earth that has over 100 combat-coded fifth-gen fighters. And to your point, Mr. Chairman, we are the platform for expeditionary forces, including the Army's new 11th Airborne Division that can deploy on a moment's notice anywhere in the entire Northern Hemisphere. But we need to make sure that Alaska becomes the logistical hub for the Arctic, for our power projection in the Arctic. In recent years, the Russian Navy has stepped up the scale of its exercises near Alaska. It is doing all kinds of bear bomber runs at our state. They're so common that they don't even make the news anymore, several already this year. Last year, Russia and China, for the first time, deployed a joint naval task force, 7 ships, to Alaska's waters. We responded, I love the Coast Guard, but we responded with 1 small Coast Guard cutter. I called some of our senior military and Coast Guard leaders saying, look, this is going to continue. If it happens again, we need to show a much stronger robust approach. You may have read this summer, it happened again. This time 11 Russian and Chinese ships operating off the coast of Alaska. To our military, Northcom and Indo-PACOM's credit, they sent 4 destroyers and P-8s to track this very significant joint Russian-Chinese naval task force. But we must make sure that this is a sign of things to come. We not only need more Coast Guard assets, but also a Navy presence back in Alaska. We will need to be able to respond more rapidly in the future to these kind of incursions. Unfortunately, and I love our Department of Defense, the DoD has been asleep at the switch on the Arctic. The leaders on these issues have been the House and the Senate. We have been pressing for provisions in the NDAA, in the Coast Guard bill, year after year to get our Pentagon and, quite frankly, our Coast Guard to focus more on the Arctic. As a matter of fact, right now the NDAA is being marked up. I'm going to hustle back over to the Senate side. It's our conference with the House and the Senate. We have my provision, the Arctic Security Initiative, in this year's NDAA to make sure that we focus on the Arctic. And to your point, Mr. Chairman, the United States has not invested in Arctic infrastructure. The number, actually, of Russian icebreakers is 54, many of which are nuclear-powered. They are weaponized. We have 2 icebreakers, and 1 is broken. That's what we have. We're building more. We're looking to purchase off the shelf some, but we need to make sure that we are trying to close this very, very significant icebreaker gap. Even China's icebreaking capacity is on pace to surpass ours in 2025. And as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, they're not even an Arctic nation. We recognize the importance of freedom of navigation transits through the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, but we need to do the same for the Northern Sea route from Europe to the Bering Strait. Putin has called this region the new Suez Canal that he will control. We can't let them do that. So I commend the Coast Guard on working to get more icebreakers, commend the Coast Guard cutter Healy that transited near the Northern Sea route near the Russian EEZ for making this difficult and challenging transit. But icebreakers, Mr. Chairman, are only the beginning. The level of infrastructure, domain awareness, reliable comms that are sufficient to support America's security needs in the Arctic are lacking. As I mentioned, Congress has made important progress. We've begun work on a deep water port in Nome, Alaska. That's Western Alaska in the Arctic region that can handle icebreakers, that can handle Navy destroyers. But right now, we have no infrastructure anywhere near the Arctic that can even handle Navy ships and American icebreakers. So we need infrastructure. We need a whole of government effort. We must respond to bolster our presence, both military and civilian, to make sure that we can protect our national security interests, economic security interests, energy security interests, and environmental security interests that are so critical to our national security. I do want to mention one final thing. We need to do this in conjunction with all federal agencies and Arctic communities, especially the very patriotic Alaska Native communities, our indigenous communities that have been living in the Arctic for literally thousands of years and are some of the most patriotic Americans anywhere. So again, Mr. Chairman, this is a critical issue for the 21st century. It's a key area of great power competition against Russia and China, and I really want to commend you and the committee members to taking the time for this important hearing, and just very, very appreciative.
Well, thank you for being here. We deeply appreciate it, and I know you've got to rush off to the conference. So
got to make sure I get that Arctic security initiative provision in the bill.
Totally get it. Thank you again, sir, for being here. The committee will stand in brief recess while the clerks arrange for the second panel of witnesses. The chair may declare, the chair may declare the committee in recess at any point. The purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony on the present and future challenges in the Arctic region and evaluate the United States Coast Guard's unique role in maintaining freedom of movement, defending vital U.S. national interests, and protecting U.S. sovereignty in the region. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. The United States faces a world fraught with peril. We have an unprecedented crisis at our southwest border. Israel, our closest ally in the Middle East, endured the deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust. Russia's ongoing and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine is the largest armed conflict in Europe since World War II. East Asia is on a hair trigger because of the expansionist tendencies of the Chinese Communist Party in the South China Sea. So you might be asking, why is the Committee on Homeland Security having a hearing about the Arctic? In Congress, our daily business is often dictated by the latest disaster or most recent crisis. And to be sure, there are plenty of those. However, during my time in the military and beginning at West Point, of course, I was taught to view the battlefield through a strategic lens.
I've said previously, it's imperative that the committee carry out its oversight responsibilities on the many varied threats facing the homeland. To be certain, the Arctic is a region of increasing importance to Homeland Security, and it is one area where I believe there's an opportunity for bipartisan cooperation. Time is of the essence. With climate change, Arctic waters are increasingly open to maritime activity like shipping, energy exploration, fishing, and tourism. Adversaries like Russia and China are trying to gain strategic advantage, and the U.S. must be ready to assert and protect its interests in the region. The Coast Guard is central to the United States' efforts and activities in the Arctic, but its capacity is severely limited by a lack of icebreakers. Currently, it has only one heavy polar icebreaker, the Polar Star, which was commissioned in 1976 and is well past its expected service life. The vessel is focused on work related to our research station in Antarctica, making it difficult for the Coast Guard to maintain a presence in the Arctic. Meanwhile, Russia has more than 50 icebreakers and has been building more, increasing its military presence in the region by opening new bases, reopening old ones, and enhancing its communications capabilities. In response to the dire need for more icebreakers and maritime assets built for the Arctic, Congress appropriated historic funding to begin construction of new polar security cutters, or PCSs. The Coast Guard awarded contracts for the first two of these PSCs, and in 2019, with delivery originally expected late next year. Unfortunately, construction has not yet begun due to a variety of factors, and delivery will be delayed. I hope to hear from the Coast Guard today about the plan going forward and the new timeline and cost estimates for the polar security cutters. This acquisition program will be a long-term effort, so Congress must help ensure shipbuilding stays on budget and meets critical deadlines. In addition to addressing the icebreaker shortage, the U.S. has to strategize for the long term, since conditions in the Arctic will continue to change and nations like Russia and China will try to leverage those changes to their advantage. Indeed, China has already declared itself a near-Arctic state, despite having no geographic connection to the Arctic, and will undoubtedly continue to exert its influence in the region. In recognition of the need for a whole-of-government strategy, the Biden-Harris administration published a national strategy for the Arctic region just over a year ago, an important step toward ensuring U.S. interests are protected. The strategy includes 4 pillars, the first of which is security, stating, quote, "We will deter threats to the U.S. homeland and our allies by enhancing the capabilities to defend our interests in the Arctic, and will exercise U.S. government presence in the Arctic region as required to protect the American people and defend our sovereign territory." The strategy also rightly focused on addressing climate change and environmental protection. We must follow the science on climate change and plan accordingly for the effects of warming temperatures and reduced sea ice in the region. Additionally, the strategy highlights the importance of engaging with indigenous communities in the Arctic. The Coast Guard has established relationships with Alaska Native communities, and we must broaden and deepen those relationships going forward. Finally, the strategy recognizes that the U.S. must engage our international allies and partners on Arctic issues to strengthen our position in the region. Engaging like-minded countries and working together on areas of common interest will be critical going forward. In recognition of the important work to be done, in August 2022, the Biden-Harris administration announced the establishment of an ambassador at large for the Arctic region. The ambassador at large is charged with advancing U.S. policy in the Arctic, engaging with counterparts in Arctic and non-Arctic nations, as well as indigenous groups, and working closely with domestic stakeholders. President Biden's nomination has been pending in the Senate since February 2023. This fall, the Government Accountability Office reported that the new ambassador at large position could help advance U.S. priorities in the Arctic region. I hope this position will be confirmed without further delay. Today, I look forward to the witnesses sharing their expertise about Homeland Security priorities in the Arctic and what Congress can do to support them and their priorities. Before I close, I want to express particular appreciation to the Government Accountability Office for their work on Arctic issues, and to our witness, Ms. Kinney, for her willingness to testify on extremely short notice just after the Thanksgiving holiday. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement from Abby Tingstad of the RAND Corporation.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I thank the ranking member for his opening comments. I'm pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses, and I ask the witnesses to please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give to the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Congress, House of Representatives, will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and you may be seated. I'd like to now formally introduce our witnesses. Vice Admiral Peter Gautier. Did I pronounce that correctly, sir?
It's Gautier, sir, unless you're in Mississippi, and that's Gaucher.
Okay. Well, I am from Mississippi, so it works. Assumed the duties of the Coast Guard Deputy Commandant for Operations in June of 22. In this capacity, he is responsible for the development of operational strategy, policy, guidance, and resources that address national priorities. Ms. Krista Berzolski serves as the Acting Assistant Secretary of Trade and Economic Security at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And in this capacity, Ms. Berzolski oversees a team focused on a wide range of national trade and economic security policy issues. Thank you. Ms. Chelsea Kinney serves as the Director for the International Affairs and Trade Team for the U.S. Government Accountability Office. I thank the witnesses for being here today, and I now recognize Vice Admiral Gautier for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, and the distinguished members of the committee. The Coast Guard is deeply appreciative for your interest in the Arctic and the crucial role that the Coast Guard plays in promoting peace, stability, and prosperity and cooperation across the Arctic region through our operations, engagements, partnerships, and influence. I ask that my written testimony be entered into the record. Chairman Green, Ranking Member, your statements, in addition to Senator Sullivan's statements, very eloquently summarize the types of threats that we're facing in the Arctic at large and the Coast Guard's critical role in the Arctic region. I'd just like to maybe reinforce some of the key points that you had made. We are witnessing a dramatic transformation of the Arctic's physical, operational, and geostrategic environment. We're witnessing firsthand the increasing impacts of climate change, and how it's opening up new access to Arctic waters. This drives greater activity in the Arctic region, and with it, increased risk across the maritime sector. And the Coast Guard is deeply concerned about the rising strategic risk to our nation as Russia and China compete for diplomatic, economic, and strategic advantage and influence in the Arctic. While the mission of the high latitudes have evolved since the Coast Guard started operating there 150 years ago, our commitment to the region has remained constant. We're operating forward to address the safety and security of our Arctic residents and mariners who make their living there, home porting new cutters, investing in infrastructure and capabilities, prioritizing our operations in the region, and strengthening our international partnerships. Changing conditions in the Arctic are driving increased demand for Coast Guard services, and we have a sense of urgency to make sure we can deliver those services now and well into the future. Despite the geographical remoteness and logistical challenges inherent in all operations in the Arctic, the Coast Guard is meeting demands through our flexible and expeditionary approach. This year in Operation Arctic Shield, we increased seasonal presence in the U.S. Arctic by deploying cutters, aircraft, and shore forces to respond to search and rescue cases, inspect bulk oil facilities, complete commercial fishing vessel exams, conduct oil spill and mass rescue exercises, and training and outreach events across 91 Arctic communities. Coast Guard cutters provide persistent presence along the U.S.-Russian maritime boundary line, and each summer now, as you've heard, the Coast Guard cutters intercept Russian and Chinese military vessels sailing through the U.S. exclusive economic zone. Both nations have declared the Arctic a strategic priority, and they continue to make significant investments to advance their own interests. We, the Coast Guard, need to make significant investments too. And the Coast Guard appreciates the continued support from Congress to build the next generation of Coast Guard capability for the Arctic. A top acquisition priority is the Polar Security Cutter, and we're working with Bollinger, Mississippi Shipyard to advance that effort. We've asked for the funding in this year's budget request to increase near-term presence in the Arctic through acquisition of a commercially available medium polar icebreaker. With Congress's help, we're moving forward to build the shoreside infrastructure necessary to support a fleet to enable it to operate in the harshest conditions on Earth to advance our U.S. interests. The Coast Guard's strategic influence extends well beyond just the U.S. Arctic to the region at large. Through the Arctic Council and the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, we continue to work with like-minded nations to advance shared interests. This year, we exercised with partners off Greenland and the Beaufort Sea to expand search and rescue and pollution response interoperability across the international community. The Coast Guard's polar icebreaker, Healy, working with the scientific community service polar research buoys just north of Russia's exclusive economic zone, and continued sailing to Europe for engagements with Norway, Denmark, and Iceland as just a few examples. Never has the Coast Guard leadership been more important in the Arctic than it is right now. As captured in a host of national security and Arctic-related strategies, the Coast Guard is in a unique position within government to confront historic maritime challenges and keep the Arctic peaceful, stable, prosperous, and cooperative. The Coast Guard is committed to assert all efforts to meet these challenges. Thank you again, Chairman and Ranking Member, for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral Gautier. I now recognize Ms. Brzezowski for her 5 minutes to summarize her opening statement.
Thank you so much, and good morning, Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of the committee. Very much appreciated, and I'm honored by the opportunity today to discuss the Department of Homeland Security's ongoing efforts in the Arctic. All nations recognize the importance of the Arctic. Both our allies and our strategic competitors jockey for diplomatic, economic, and military advantages in a region with immense natural resources, trade, and geopolitical importance. Despite this competition, however, the Arctic is a space where the world can cooperate and work together to advance scientific research and ensure public safety. As an Arctic nation, the United States must protect and safeguard the Arctic for the benefit of all. At DHS, we view Arctic security as homeland security, and we're dedicated to safeguarding the space. The brave men and women of the department work tirelessly to secure Arctic lands and waters. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, for example, protect 15 ports of entry and 1,500 miles of land border, working alongside U.S. Coast Guard and 33,000 miles of maritime border throughout Alaska. We also have the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, who work closely with communities to protect critical infrastructure and resources in the region. When disaster does strike, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, under the Department of Homeland Security, stands ready to help communities in need. Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI, personnel protect Arctic communities against malicious actors, such as transnational criminal organizations and nation-state actors. And of course, across air, roads, and railways, the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, ensures safe travel throughout the Arctic. To achieve this diverse mission, DHS works in close partnership with key allies to enhance our work across the region. For example, Secretary Mayorkas established the first ever Tribal Homeland Security Advisory Council last year to strengthen our partnerships with the tribal nations. Moreover, earlier this year, the department began work to establish a new Center of Excellence for Homeland Security in the Arctic to leverage the intellectual power of the U.S. academic community. DHS continues to be a leader in developing and advancing the President's Arctic Agenda, which, as we've heard, seeks to pursue an Arctic that is cooperative, stable, peaceful, and prosperous. The department was a key contributor to the implementation plan for the national strategy for the Arctic regions and continues to work to enact these goals. This plan, established last month, highlights the importance of Homeland Security priorities in the Arctic agenda. DHS has been a strong advocate for this holistic approach to Arctic security, to highlight the need to safeguard Arctic communities from all hazards and to promote economic security. In this vein, I'm honored to echo President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas' announcement just this last Monday, regarding the establishment of a DHS Supply Chain Resilience Center. The new center will enhance the department's position to minimize disruptions from all hazards that threaten critical trade infrastructures and the supply of key goods and services to U.S. citizens in Alaska and across the country. Moving forward, DHS will continue to innovate and adapt to meet the evolving challenges that we see in the Arctic. We will continue building on our successes and partnership to advance Arctic homeland security. And to that end, I'm also proud to announce that the department will release our 2024 DHS Arctic Action Plan early next year, in line with the administration's goals for the Arctic. The plan will build on the implementation plan just released by announcing specific DHS milestones that the department will use to achieve our evolving security goals in the region. So again, thank you to the committee and its members for the interest in this very important effort and for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Brzezowski. Thank you for being here. I now recognize Ms. Kinney for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss GAO's work on U.S. priorities and diplomacy in the Arctic. My testimony focuses on key factors that affect the advancement of U.S. Arctic priorities. Arctic-related issues have increasingly become global issues. In recent years, the effect of climate change, technological advancements, and economic opportunities have driven increasing interest and activity in the Arctic region. Escalation of great power competition between the U.S., Russia, and China has also heightened tensions in the Arctic's geopolitical environment. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 has further affected coordination among Arctic states and changed the security landscape, including seeing additional Arctic states join NATO. The U.S. has articulated its Arctic priorities through a series of strategies since the 1970s. The most recent strategy was published in October 2022 and serves as a framework for addressing emerging challenges and opportunities in the Arctic. The strategy identifies 4 pillars spanning domestic and international issues, from security to international cooperation and governance. Over 40 federal entities informed the strategy, which illustrates the breadth of federal entities with Arctic roles and responsibilities. Our September 2023 report identified areas in which the federal government's management of U.S. priorities in the Arctic has been successful and what might limit future efforts. We spoke with Arctic experts and officials from federal agencies, the state of Alaska, Alaska Native organizations, and other Arctic countries. Here's what we heard. First, what's working well? We heard White House-led coordination and Arctic Council engagement are providing important mechanisms for interagency coordination and global influence on Arctic issues. Notably, we heard that the Arctic Executive Steering Committee provides a mechanism for information sharing on interagency Arctic projects and strategy efforts. Further, other Arctic countries said the U.S. provides important expertise to the region on things like wildfire management, search and rescue, climate change, and sustainable development through its involvement in the Arctic Council. Second, what's not working as well? Stakeholders said federal agencies weren't meaningfully coordinating with the state of Alaska or Alaska Natives. Specifically, we heard that coordination was often irregular and last minute, and input was repeatedly provided and not addressed. Inconsistent Alaskan input is an even greater issue, given another concern we heard: the limited awareness among Americans about Arctic issues and related U.S. activities. Stakeholders suggested that an increasing understanding of Arctic issues and their importance to the overall U.S. goals would be important to successfully implement the new Arctic strategy. They also questioned the depth of federal agencies' understanding of the region, given that some agencies cover broad geographic areas from offices located far outside of Alaska. Third, an area of opportunity. Stakeholders were supportive of the creation of the Arctic Ambassador-at-Large position in August 2022. They said it signaled the continued importance the U.S. places on Arctic issues and would provide a single voice for communicating about Arctic issues around the world. This position would be responsible for coordinating across the State Department and with the interagency, and would be able to speak with foreign partners on security issues, which has been particularly important since security issues are excluded from the scope of the Arctic Council. However, stakeholders also identified features they saw as critical to the ambassador position's success. These include developing a consistent position and formal office that would span administrations and provide greater institutional knowledge. They further suggested that ensuring the ambassador position had clear roles, concrete objectives, and the convening authority necessary to bring key parties together. In closing, the Arctic region is of immense geopolitical significance to the U.S., its allies, and to its strategic adversaries. Advancing U.S. priorities will require strengthened leadership and coordination across the federal government and with other Arctic countries. State, as the federal lead for Arctic diplomacy, will play a key role in managing heightened security tensions in the region. In developing the ambassador position, it will be important to ensure it has the features needed to effectively lead states' coordination on U.S. diplomacy in the Arctic. Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the committee, this concludes my statement, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Kinney. Members will be recognized in order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Admiral Gautier, you said, I think in your testimony, you mentioned some of the port calls of the Healy, Iceland, and some of the other places. This question is really for both you and Ms. Brzezowski. In the context of the Arctic and the Antarctic, could you guys describe how both the Coast Guard and DHS are involved in projecting the soft power of the country?
Mr. Chairman, soft power in the Arctic and elsewhere is absolutely critical to advance the international rules-based order that we all enjoy. When you look at what our adversaries are doing to directly undermine those very norms, it's through alliances, partnerships, and the use of soft power in the Arctic and around the world that helps in best way in order to counter that. So for us, soft power includes things like the port calls that you explained. And whenever the Coast Guard cutter Healy gets underway in the Arctic, it's for science, it's for enforcing our own national interests and sovereign interests. It's also the soft power where we actually carry crew members from other countries on board. And then it's the port calls that we did in Tromsø, Norway, and then Reykjavik, Iceland, and then elsewhere. it reinforces these relationships with the international community with the values that we share to directly counter the sorts of forces that are undermining those values.
Please.
Yeah, thank you for the question. As I'm looking across the expertise of our various components outside of the Coast Guard, what comes to mind first is the very vital and necessary relationships with the tribal communities as sort of an essence of maintaining that soft power. Some of the recent activity in that work, or in that area, has been the establishment of as I said in my statement, a tribal Homeland Security Advisory Committee. And that is indispensable in getting the perspective of the local community where we might not have as robust of a physical presence in the areas where they are. 2 Alaskan Natives are part of that community, or of that advisory committee, and lend their particular expertise and perspective. I also think looking across to what our Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, does, not only in the area post a disaster or helping to respond to something that has happened, but have a very robust presence with the allocation of grants and engagement with communities in a very proactive way to use their authorities, use their grants, and use their expertise to work with communities that may have been impacted by climate change, erosion, or their communities are needing to shift. And so very robust grant programs in that area that can assist with the development of some of the soft power that you're mentioning.
Thank you. Thank you. Admiral Gautier, if I were to ask you, what is your #1 most needed thing that Congress can help with, what would it be?
Congressman, we need your continued support to build out our polar security cutters and rapidly accelerate us into the future where we can have a greater capacity for icebreakers.
So another cutter. Tell me, what is let's say 10 years from now, what is the total number needed 10 years from now?
As a result of a congressional requirement, the Coast Guard recently did an analysis and completed a report and submitted it to Congress on the fleet mix that we think we need to answer your question. And the answer that we have is 8 to 9 icebreakers. And that's a mix of heavy icebreakers like the Polar Star and the Polar Security Cutters that we're building now, and medium icebreakers like the Healy that have shallower drafts and can get into tighter spaces and shallower areas.
I was been fortunate enough in my congressional delegation travel to be on a Norwegian icebreaker and to be on a Finnish icebreaker. They seem to be able to build those pretty inexpensively. What are your thoughts on leasing versus owning?
We've been considering leasing for actually a number of years, and we are really, really challenged in order to do that for a couple of different reasons. The first is that an icebreaker, a security cutter, is essentially a U.S. sovereign warship. It's a military vessel. And when we lease a vessel, we're really challenged to have the kinds of presence and authorities, capabilities that we would like to have on a leased vessel. The other is that there's some rules for scoring that just on the budget that make it really impractical.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I now recognize the ranking member for his 5 minutes question.
Thank you very much. Admiral, the Congressional Research Service has noted that commercial fishing, shipping, oil and gas development, and tourism in the Arctic is on the rise as the ice decreases. One of the things we see is in other parts of the world, China and Russia kind of exploits certain opportunities. Do you see that as a potential, those areas as potential for exploitation on the part of Russia and China?
I do, Ranking Member, and that's because Russia and China have said so. If you read the Chinese Arctic strategy, they describe, as we have here, that an opening Arctic region provides opportunities for resource exploitation, minerals, oil, fishing, that they are interested in. Russia views the Arctic as absolutely essential to its own vital interests for maritime trade, and they've declared that just recently that they intend on operating shipping in the Northern Sea Route year-round. So we do expect that there will be increased activities from Russia and China in that area. We aim with the international community to ensure that that's in accordance with international rules and norms and lawful.
Thank you. Ms. Kinney, you talked a little bit about the ambassador at large, his job, and the fact that it's, at this point, lacks confirmation. Do we have, to your knowledge, someone who's fitting that role on a temporary basis, or how is it operating at this point?
Thank you for the question. The ambassador-at-large position is, according to the State Department, something that would elevate the prior U.S. Arctic coordinator position, which is currently vacant. But this vacancy, this inconsistent staffing at this particular position has been a problem for a long term. Before, the U.S. coordinator served for 2 years, but recently vacated this summer. Prior to that, there was a several-year lapse, and then there was a special representative that served in the same function. Basically, there's been different positions with different levels of seniority, different responsibilities within the State Department that have intermittently provided this kind of leadership. However, we heard again from stakeholders that it was really important that we were able to find consistent leadership for this particular role within the state and, of course, across the interagency and with our Arctic partners that had the right convening authority, the right line of effort, a line of coordination to the Secretary of State, and a deep bench, really developing the institutional knowledge to be able to provide that kind of broad Arctic leadership over a period of time.
So, I hate to butcher your name, but Ms. Brzezowski?
I have a feeling you're talking about me. Yes.
Yeah.
You got it. You got it.
I got it?
You got it.
Okay. I have that Mississippi challenge, too.
There's
Yeah, right.
There's a silent Z-O.
Well, based on what Ms. Kinney just said, is that pretty much your assessment of how things are working right now?
I really would have to defer to my Department of State colleagues, but I can say that the nomination of the new position is something DHS certainly supports, and DHS's, and State Department's role in just providing that convening capability, the diplomatic role that is played by that position is absolutely indispensable.
Yeah, well, you talked a little bit about coordinating with people in that region from your perspective. Tell us a little bit about how that works.
Yeah, absolutely. As you look across the mission of DHS, you're seeing, as you know, a wide scope of responsibilities. So we have, I think the most obvious presence in the region is going to be the U.S. Coast Guard, very visible presence with, I believe, over 2,500 individuals in that region. This is something where you see them in the maritime ports of entry, but also in the community. In addition, we have Customs and Border Protection in other types of law enforcement presence. So these are going to be entities and Transportation Security Administration entities that you're seeing at airports or at other ports of entry. And then I guess another sort of very visible way of engaging with the communities and having these partnerships is through our Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. These are the entities that are responsible for working with state, local, tribal, territorial, as well as federal stakeholders and tribal communities to understand the vulnerabilities of critical infrastructures in the region. So pipelines or cables or these maritime and other types of ports of entry. So any kind of critical infrastructure, and working with those communities, that is really their bread and butter, to understand the capabilities and to develop actions to strengthen those, the resiliency of those critical infrastructures and prepare for what mitigations and responses could be should there be either a physical or cyber challenge.
Thank you much. You're back, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning. Admiral Gaucher, I had the great honor of sitting next to the legendary Representative Don Young for 6 years in Congress. For some reason, Don liked me and took me under his wing literally on my first day in Congress. I sat next to him for 6 years. He was my friend. And every year we had opportunity. Any of you that knew Don Young, he was quite passionate about the state of Alaska and the significance of the Arctic region. And every year during the NDAA debates and appropriations discussions, we would talk about the need to grow and enhance and strengthen our response capabilities and patrol capabilities in the Arctic and the need for icebreakers. And Don shared a wealth of knowledge with me that he had garnered over the course of over 4 decades of service in Congress. And I came to understand that he was completely accurate with his assessment. We must have American-built and American-owned, American-flagged and piloted icebreaker vessels. And Don also clarified that there's a place for leasing as well. That in the enhancement of our ability to respond, especially for the Coast Guard, but to include the Navy, there's a place for leasing, but we must have ownership. And I've never quite had it explained with such clarity as you stated, Admiral, regarding the response capabilities and the authority of an actual Coast Guard owned or a United States government owned vessel. And in international waters, what that means and signifies should we face threat, which we face increasing threat from the Chinese and the Russian presence in the Arctic. And to focus on the polar security cutters, if I may for a moment, Admiral, I'd like to ask you, you're aware that the shipyards of America play a significant role with developing our fleets for the Coast Guard and the Navy. And Bollinger Shipyard is a Louisiana-based shipyard. They work with the Coast Guard on many contracts. And they recently took over the PSC, the Polar Security Cutter contract. They took great risk assuming that contract, a massive amount of risk, from Halter Marine in 2022. The contract was awarded in 2019, and in my opinion, it has many challenges. Not only does the contract include production of a vessel that has not been built in 50 years, but inflation over the last 2 years has caused an incredible rise in production costs. So how is the Coast Guard working with a United States shipbuilder like Bollinger to help them perform within the parameters of the reality of inflation to produce a much-needed ice-breaking vessel, a polar security cutter? How is the Coast Guard working with the shipbuilder?
First, Congressman, there's a lot of affection for Congressman Young and the United States Coast Guard. We would not be who we are in Alaska today without his enduring support. In terms of shipbuilding and Bollinger, very closely with Bollinger. We knew that we would have challenges with this particular acquisition. We haven't built a heavy icebreaker in the United States for 50 years. This is the most complex Coast Guard cutter that we will have ever built, and we knew there would be risks and challenges in the process. With Bollinger taking over or taking ownership of the shipyard, we're encouraged at the progress now and the acceleration that they're providing in that particular contract. I was just down there with some of our senior acquisition professionals in October to look at what's going on. They're making progress on the detailed design, and we hope and we believe that construction will be able to begin in 2024.
You have a high level of confidence that it will be able to move forward effectively without delay?
I don't want to in any way gloss over the really substantial challenges in this very unique vessel type, but we really do believe that we're building a ship and we're building a shipyard at the same time.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Admiral, for your response. You can look forward to a great cooperative effort with my office and this Congress. I now recognize my colleague, Mr. Correa, for questioning for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today, your good testimony. And Admiral Gaudier, I just want to say, over the years, I come to appreciate the good work the Coast Guard does. I don't think people realize that not only are you in the Arctic, you're in Antarctic as well. You're as far out as North Korea enforcing the laws in that area when it comes to trade. You're in the Caribbean doing some anti-narco interdiction. You're all over the place. We talked today about the Arctic. We talk about the fact that we're trying to build another cutter, icebreaker. In my opinion, we're never going to equal the assets Russia or China have or can produce. What are the multipliers out there we can rely on? Ms. Brzezowski, you talked about soft power. Let's think about playing not checkers, but chess here. The Antarctic, the Arctic, the Americas. We have 2 wars going on right now, possibly a third. And we've got to take care of the home base, the Americas. And I think this is what really we're talking about here. I keep hearing the echoes here of we haven't invested enough to protect our northern border. We haven't done enough to protect the resources. And frankly, given every bet we got to cover around the world, it's going to be challenging to do all the above. But you know what? I think the American public expects us to do our job, and that is to make sure we protect Alaskan territory, American water rights, resources in that area, as well as all the way to Antarctica. General question to you, Admiral. What's the resource multiplier here? How do we get it done? Today, not tomorrow, and tomorrow as well.
Thank you for your kind remarks about the Coast Guard, Congressman. The Polar Star is en route from Hawaii to Sydney, Australia for a quick port call before going into Antarctica. So that's happening as we speak. So, you know, a lot of this is being driven by this number 54, 55 Russian icebreakers. To put that in context, they're employing those icebreakers differently than we might think. Many of those icebreakers are local, and they're there just to break out their harbors, break ice in their harbors to manage their own maritime trade. We actually have a fleet of Coast Guard cutters, small Coast Guard cutters in our eastern and Great Lakes ports that do that very thing.
So we can't compare apples to apples, so to speak, in general terms, but again, how do we make sure we're doing our job in terms of the resources, the multipliers? We have other assets they don't have. Please continue.
So we don't need parity, sir, with Russians. We do need more. We do this by aggressively managing our risk portfolio. 11 statutory missions in the Coast Guard. We operate globally, but the Homeland is our most important place that we operate here, which is why we have a razor-sharp focus on our key missions that save lives, like search and rescue, like law enforcement, like boating safety. Keeping our maritime transportation system open is absolutely critical. And that's why when we talk Arctic, there's a much broader portfolio of Coast Guard needs that we have in terms of building our offshore patrol cutters, and we just launched the first offshore patrol cutter in Florida a couple of weeks ago, making sure that that acquisition moves forward smartly. But Congressman, I'll share with you, our major challenge and benefit here is people. The men and women of the Coast Guard are absolutely extraordinary.
Yes, they are.
We are challenged with a historic recruiting problem that's similar to the other services are happening.
I'm going to ask a written question. I'm going to submit a written question to you on this area. Ms. Brzezowski, I'm going to do the same, but I'm going to ask it here, which is, what are the soft power multipliers as we really look at the Americas here? It's kind of our, not our sovereign territory, but our backyard. How do we take care of this?
Yeah, I mean, it really is a fantastic question. I'll answer briefly here and happy to respond for the record. But, I think the best force multipliers are going to be to, yes, build on the presence that we have with both personnel and assets in the region with partnerships. So the partnerships I had mentioned before with the tribal, but also with state, local, the array of actors. And then the second would be, I really am hopeful that our new Supply Chains Resiliency Center is going to allow us in the Arctic, but elsewhere, to just work smarter to identify supply chain challenges, risks, vulnerabilities that can get consumers, American citizens, the goods that they want through supply chains that we trust, that are that align with our values, and that sort of support our domestic industry. And DHS has vast authorities in that regard, and so that center is really going to be the hub for how we can take a very much a closer look at the supply chains that feed every critical infrastructure and make sure that they're working efficiently and that they're promoting U.S. jobs and livelihoods.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez, is recognized for 5 minutes for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In terms of the Arctic, I look at it as Russia and China maybe versus the United States and Canada. Can you tell us about our Canadian assets and our friends? What kind of assets they have in the Arctic?
Congressman, our Canadian friends are also in a major shipbuilding phase. That's both the Canadian Coast Guard, which is a civilian force, and the Canadian Navy. They, through their shipyards, are building ice-capable sort of frigates, frigate corvette-sized vessels. One actually accompanied the Coast Guard cutter Healy during a round circumnavigating North America last year. They are very much invested. Congressman, I'd also extend that effort to our partners in Scandinavia and in the other Arctic Council nations. We are all feeling the same pressure to keep the Arctic safe and secure, and they're all making investments with us.
Are the investments made by our friends also, do you think that they're sufficient, that they need to be stepped up? Obviously, our efforts need to be stepped up too. We have 2 icebreakers, and one of you said is broken right now, not operating, or?
The Healy had some steering issues. Those are fixed, and it's on its way to the Panama Canal. So we have 2 operational.
And how many do you think the United States is going to need in order to protect our interests in the Arctic region?
We're going to need 8 to 9, sir. A combination of polar security cutters, heavy, and then a medium icebreaker in order to provide us persistent presence in the U.S. Arctic off Alaska, on the Atlantic Arctic, and then that also includes a presence for Antarctica to recapitalize so we can continue to provide our presence and our missions down there.
Are there plans to build these ships, or this is a wish for?
We're planning on it, sir. We have asked in the fiscal year 2024 budget for money to advance Polar Security Cutter number 3. We're in the pre-acquisition phase for the medium cutters, the Arctic Security Cutter. But in the meantime, we know we need to field capability more quickly. So in the 2024 budget, we've asked for money to purchase a commercial icebreaker, which is a medium icebreaker. So in the near term, we can have immediate presence. In the longer term, we can do the sorts of missions that we need to do in the Arctic.
The Chinese have shown a willingness and a proclivity actually to operate large fishing fleets around the world. Are they starting to do the same up in the Arctic region where we should be?
Not yet, sir. There is an international agreement that prohibits fishing in the central Arctic region that's north of the Bering and international waters. But we know there's interest. Fish stocks are moving north, and there have been some discussions within that body that governs that on doing some test fisheries to understand how that might be regulated. But China, as well as other countries, are going to be interested in fishing there when that's permitted.
Oil exploration, are there any treaties that govern oil exploration in the Arctic region?
I think there's some mention, so there is no treaty that governs the overall Arctic region other than UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It is a basin ocean, essentially. And I think there is some mention of oil exploration in UNCLOS. I don't know that off the top of my head, though.
Because that would concern me. That would be a place where, well, Russia obviously is a big, oil, but any country can go into the Arctic and just plop down a rig and start drilling if they want?
Congressman, there are already lines that are drawn under the UN Convention for extended continental shelves for that sort of resource exploitation. There's some disagreements in those, and there's some friction there. But I think if there were oil exploration and production, it would be done on already sanctioned international outer continental shelf that are related to nation states, if that makes sense.
And who are those nation states?
The United States through all the Arctic states, Russia, Canada, the United States through our extended continental shelf.
Fair enough. Okay, I yield my time.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Carter.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Yesterday, I had the pleasure of hosting a field hearing in my home state of Louisiana. I'd like to personally thank the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. D'Esposito, and ranking member Thompson for joining me in Louisiana for what proved to be a very successful field hearing. Climate change is being felt worldwide with several and severe natural disasters like hurricanes, droughts, and wildfires. Admiral Gaucher is from the part of the world that I'm from.
I was a captain in the port of New Orleans. Gaucher sounds great to me.
Gaucher sounds good. Fantastic. How does the Coast Guard actively incorporate climate change considerations into its operational strategies? And what specific measures or initiatives are in place to address the anticipated impacts on maritime and coastal security, sir?
Congressman, recognizing that climate change was just going to change the way the Coast Guard had to do business, we drew up a strategic plan for that covers 3 different efforts. The first is we need to be able to respond to more and more frequent natural disasters. Typhoon Merbok, a typhoon hit Alaska last year, right, in southwest Alaska, and did quite a bit of damage there. We need to be prepared for that at greater capacity. The other is that we need to build more resilience into the United States Coast Guard in terms of our shore infrastructure, our piers, our facilities ashore, and we have plans to do that. And the third one is that we're a regulator, and actually we lead the delegation to the International Maritime Organization that negotiated in the international community carbon caps on international shipping by 2050. So as a result of that, through U.S. efforts with the Coast Guard delegation, we negotiated that by 2050, international shipping needs to be zero carbon.
Excellent. How's the Coast Guard collaborating with other agencies to adapt the changing climate and ensure effective responses? One of the things that we talked about in New Orleans yesterday was making sure that these interagencies were working together and not duplicating efforts, and making sure that we're complementing each other in our effort to counteract climate change and bring the greatest results.
Yeah, through a lot of different ways. In terms of what our goals are going to be internationally, we work through the State Department as their lead in those efforts. Here domestically, I mean, we look at FEMA as being the preeminent federal organization in terms of building national resilience, and so we follow, we take the FEMA recommendations when we're building our own, our new facilities and so on. National Weather Service and NOAA is absolutely critical in their advancing in the science and forecasting and helping us understand what storms of the future and what Coast Guard impacts might be.
Not on this matter of climate change, but I do want to give a particular shout out to the Coast Guard and the Corps of Engineers for working with my office in Louisiana. As you may or may not be aware, there was a tragic accident a year or so ago where several children found themselves finding an attractive nuisance to cool themselves off in the river. The a report was recently completed, and we'll be working on remedial measures to protect young people or anyone from the allures of the Mississippi River and the danger that it poses. So just want to say thank you to you guys for being very diligent and moving forward on that. Ms. Kinney, how does these agencies coordinate to make sure that you leverage each other's work and not duplicate efforts?
Thank you for the question. So there are a number of domestic and internationally focused coordination efforts that exist across the government. And it's really important because for the development of the national strategy, we saw over 40 federal entities actually contributed to that. So there really is a whole government approach. There really is, every agency is really an Arctic agency when you think about the support that they're providing to Alaska. So we found a couple of things. You know, we heard positive feedback from the Arctic Executive Steering Committee and their role in coordinating the domestic agencies and interagency projects and their development of the strategy. And we, again, heard positive feedback about the U.S. participation in the Arctic Council in terms of working with our other Arctic states.
Fantastic. In 20 seconds, I need each of you, if you can, just tell us, you're here with us now. We're very grateful for your presentations. Tell us, what can we do as a committee to improve interagency coordination with the Arctic? Is there some silver bullet, if you will, that sitting before this committee, if there's something we can do to assist each of you more, what might that be? And a second each.
One thing we pointed out was continuing to monitor the implementation of the national strategy. There are some long-term investments that will need to be made and some agencies that will need to work together to be able to make those kinds of investments. It's important that we're monitoring the implementation, ensuring those agencies have the resources.
I would have to say the moving forward of the ambassador at large position. It's not a direct DHS equity, but certainly one that I think my colleagues at the Department of State would appreciate.
Congressman, not just support for building ships, but it's also supporting our incredible people and the shore infrastructure that we need to operate those ships.
Very good. Thank you. I yield back, sir.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Pfluger, the gentleman from Texas, for his 5 minutes question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing, and I thank the witnesses for your service and for being here. I'll start with the topic on China and just really kind of digging in. I mean, I think it's probably already been discussed to some degree, but their presence in the Arctic poses obviously a threat, and their ambitions throughout the world, and especially in that region. You know, just in August of this year, 11 Chinese and Russian military vessels were identified in the region. In 2022, 3 PLAN ships were found sailing with 4 Russian vessels. So this partnership, this alliance, whatever you want to call it, is obviously concerning. Back to 2021, the warships, the Chinese warships that were in the U.S. economic zones, exclusive economic zones, another example of that. So I'll start with Assistant Secretary Brzezowski. Looking at Xi Jinping and him expressing ambitions to make China a polar great power by 2030, much like space, I kind of look at this domain as a little bit of a new frontier in the Arctic, at least, and from what DHS can see, at what pace is the PRC increasing its military profile in the Arctic?
This is an urgent question and one that we're very much focused on at the strategic level at DHS, where I am at the Office of Policy. So we'll bring our full set of authorities and resources and expertise of various components to bear against this, but I think it may be important to mention something that hasn't been discussed during this hearing yet, and that's the role that we see our authorities under Team Telecom, as well as the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And so those authorities and those interagency structures that allow us to have a national security review of foreign, be it a license application for a telecommunication system or a telecommunication supply chain, or to potentially have a acquisition that could result in a proximity of a malicious agent to a military base, or a insertion of a particular type of malware into a critical component that could then be put into a control system for a water treatment plant. So those are authorities that I think are very unique and ones that we exercise with a great amount of diligence.
If I may, just kind of looking at the pace that the PRC has increased their military profile, any response on that in the Arctic?
I don't know that I'd comment on sort of the pace of whether we've seen that increase or decrease specific to the Arctic, but I think it would be fair to say that the pace across the country has increased. So I would imagine that it's the same pace in the Arctic.
Admiral Gautier?
Congressman, the PRC military has expanded its capability at an absolutely extraordinary rate. So in the surface action groups that you mentioned, this is now a routine. This is the third time where we've seen these combined China-Russia surface action groups that have patrolled through the U.S. EEZ in the Aleutians. We have not seen Chinese military vessels north of the Bering, although they do have 2 icebreakers, civilian, as you know, state-owned icebreakers, Zhuilong 1 and Zhuilong 2, that operate both in the Arctic and Antarctic. We know that those plans are going to be expanded. They articulate sort of common values in their operations in the Arctic. We know that elsewhere they do not necessarily follow those.
And thank you for that. I'll quickly go to some of the coordination between the Coast Guard and other services, including the Air Force, and maybe the prioritization, the domain awareness, the issues that can you, in the last 50 seconds, kind of speak to the collaboration with other services and anything that you may need to continue that cooperation?
So, Congressman, the response to these sorts of threats are meeting presence with presence to make sure that these engagements are lawful. We absolutely have a very tight relationship with the Department of Defense, the United States Navy in particular. Our District 17 headquarters out of Juneau, Alaska, is very tightly integrated with Alaska Command, the 3-star command under U.S. NORTHCOM. When the Navy responded to the Surface Action Group this summer, there was a Coast Guard cutter nearby, and that had all been scripted very carefully through the joint DoD Coast Guard relationships that we have.
Thank you for the service, and I'll briefly say in my district, there's some joint programs that are run under DHS, but with Coast Guard involvement, and recently, just a couple of days ago, using a MQ-9 drone, they were able to rescue four folks in a vessel in the Gulf of Mexico using that joint mentality. So quite admirable on that. I know that's an everyday occurrence because you guys are doing that around the world, but thank you for that, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Thanadar for his 5 minutes question. The gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Chairman Green, and thank you, Ranking Member Thompson, for holding this hearing. And I thank all the witnesses here for your testimony. I certainly appreciate the hard work of the men and women of Coast Guard in keeping us safe. I know and understand the need for the icebreakers. My question to you, Admiral Gautier, as you wait for these icebreakers, what are you doing to prepare the Coast Guard in terms of infrastructure on the shore, aircrafts, personnel, so we'll be effective as these icebreakers are acquired?
Yeah, Congressman, we do talk a lot about ships, but there's a whole heck of a lot of other things that the Coast Guard is doing in Alaska with Congress's enduring support there. We've recently converted our fleet of fixed-wing aircraft from C-130Hs to Js, much more capable, much longer range. We're building housing in Kodiak to support, and piers in Kodiak in advance of homeporting 2 offshore patrol cutters that are being built in Florida, homeported in Kodiak. We're homeporting 6 fast response cutters. We've gotten 3 there now, and we're going to homeport 3 154-foot long corvettes in Alaska, and we're building out the shore infrastructure in Seward and Sitka and Kodiak and Ketchikan in order to homeport those there. So we're doing a lot, but it is really contingent on the focus of Congress and the enduring support, because it will continue to cost a lot of money in order to do this.
Talking about costs, what does a good size commercial icebreaker cost?
We've requested $150 million in the fiscal year 2024 budget to build to buy a U.S. built commercial icebreaker.
Okay. And, going back to my days as running businesses, I know there was a talk about leasing as opposed to buying. This is something of an ongoing need the Coast Guard would have to have these icebreakers. Why would you even consider leasing them as opposed to owning them and having full control over such operation?
We had examined leasing because there was congressional interest in us leasing, and I think two lessons came out of that, and it's really that, again, these are naval vessels, they're warships, they need to operate with the full sovereignty of the United States of America, which leads us towards purchasing. And then there's some rules in terms of leasing that require us to front the money for the entire of that lease that makes it really impractical.
Yeah, I agree, totally agree. What other needs besides the icebreakers? What other things Coast Guard needs to continue its
Sir, we intend on home porting the 4 polar security cutters in Seattle, Washington, and we've begun a multi-phased effort in order to dredge, deepen, renew the piers, build the shore infrastructure that we need to do there. We have asked for money in the fiscal year 2024 budget in order to complete the phase 1 and begin the phase 2 part of that. So the shore infrastructure actually is just as critical as the icebreakers themselves.
Okay. And lastly, I keep worrying about, concern about the morale of the Coast Guard, our ability to retain and attract Coast Guard workers, men and women who work so hard under some of the toughest work conditions. What's been done to ensure that, we compensate them well? They have, in terms of whether it is compensation, money, mental health services, other issues. What's been done there?
Well, thanks for recognizing the great people in the United States Coast Guard and for voicing your support for that. We are in a full-scale recruiting effort here in order to close an almost 10% gap in our enlisted workforce. And we've asked money for Congress in the fiscal year 2024 budget in order to support recruiting, in order to support the kind of monetary awards and incentives that we need in order to retain people, especially in critical rates like in the cyber rating and in other ratings like that. But as you allude to, we really need to provide top-notch medical care, and that includes mental health for these individuals, child care centers, and the kind of workplaces and tools that they need to do that. We've presented all of this to Congress in the 2024 budget, and we really appreciate help in that matter.
Thank you, Admiral. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Gonzalez, the gentleman from Texas, for his 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for all the witnesses for being here today. I think this is a very important hearing that we don't talk enough about. I actually recently got back from Antarctica, and one of the things that I saw there, and I'd like to tie it into the Arctic region, is I visited McMurdo Station, and there is very kind of a single entry point, and there was a Chinese base that essentially every aircraft is going to have to fly near, and that just highlights the fact of the growing Chinese presence in throughout the globe, Antarctica certainly. But the question I have is for the Admiral. There are serious concerns with the growing Chinese presence in the Antarctic region, capable of monitoring air traffic and collecting intelligence. Admiral, are we facing similar concerns in the Arctic region?
I think we're keeping a laser-sharp focus on those potential developments in the Arctic region. Not in North America, right? Not in the Canadian Arctic, the U.S. Arctic, or the Danish Greenland Arctic. But certainly, I think we can expect that kind of growing influence as Russia and China have operated a lot more closely together.
I'd like to build off of that. Maybe not necessarily the permanent infrastructure, but can you talk to a little bit about maybe joint exercises or things that kind of a force, show of force that China, Russia in particular have done, whether it's in the Arctic region or to highlight their ability to fight in an Arctic environment?
Yeah, certainly. I think in this environment that we're in, where Chairman Xi and Putin have expressed an unlimited relationship, right? We are seeing growth in how Russian and Chinese militaries are operating together. The latest example of this is the flotilla of vessels, the surface action group of 11 or so vessels that transited through the Aleutian, the U.S. exclusive economic zone. We are now seeing that every summer.
Excellent, thank you. My next question, also for your Admiral. The Port of Nome in Alaska recently announced its plan for an extensive expansion that would make the port the United States' first deep water Arctic port. While the project is being undertaken through a combination of federal, state, local, and private funds, the port has already publicized that it will be capable of docking military vessels. Does the Coast Guard have a plan to utilize this port for operations in the Arctic?
Yeah, well, as the Army Corps of Engineers did the feasibility study, we worked very closely with them to provide them things like what the drafts of our icebreakers would be and advise them as they completed that study. And I think as this construction moves out, the Coast Guard absolutely values additional infrastructure in the high latitudes that we can use. And I think in this case, we would absolutely use the Port of Nome for refueling stops, doing personnel exchanges as a logistics supply base, and those sorts of things.
As we get closer to this being built out and completed, I know this committee would certainly be welcome to hear any thoughts as far as what resources, whether the Coast Guard needs directly or indirectly in order to be able to access that port for all the tools that you need. My next question is, does the Coast Guard anticipate needing additional deep water ports in the Arctic region?
Our intent is to operate the Polar Security Cutter fleet out of a home port in Seattle, Washington. We do have plans, if we do get this commercially available icebreaker, for home porting somewhere in Alaska. We view this infrastructure as really helping with logistics, right? Not home porting, not basing. So if additional port locations were developed, the Coast Guard would certainly use those for our operations.
I think that's spot on. Going back to my trip that I recently took to Antarctica, the takeaway for me was the logistics, the supply chain logistics that are just needed. And I think the Coast Guard is going to play a critical role in that. Once again, whether it's permanent or whether it's temporarily helping out this Arctic region, please keep us informed on what we can do to make sure that all the infrastructure is there, but also the Coast Guard has the resources it needs. We've talked about icebreakers and some of these things for years and years. It seems like we've finally got that moved in the right direction, but please keep us posted on what other tools you need to be successful.
Certainly.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Goldman, for his 5 minutes questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this very important hearing. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. I believe this area of interest is becoming more and more important as we are seeing geopolitical issues pop up with the connections between Russia, China, and Iran. And I want to talk a little bit about the importance of the Arctic region in connection to those threats that we are seeing more and more of. Russia is only 55 miles away from Alaska in the Arctic. And we obviously are seeing a tyrant, anti-democratic tyrant in Vladimir Putin invade Ukraine. If he is successful in defeating a democracy, certainly our understanding in Congress from the experts in the administration is that this will just be the first step. And so there's a real national security risk as it relates to Alaska. And now that China is also getting involved in the Arctic, there are even more threats. And I think it's not something that has gotten enough attention. And I guess, Admiral, from your perspective in the Coast Guard, what are the additional threats that you are concerned about, and what additional resources or authorities would be helpful to combating those threats?
So certainly they're the geostrategic threats from Russia and China that you've talked about. We talk about climate change as being an incredibly substantial threat, and regardless of where people view that, it is certainly opening up the waters in the Arctic to more human activity. So we're seeing things like cruise ships, expeditionary cruise ships with under a couple of hundred passengers that are routinely operating, going all the way up to the North Pole. We're seeing more traffic, vessel traffic through the Northern Sea Route as Russia exploits their mineral resources, liquefied natural gas, and that sort of thing. So with more ships, that means more the threat of potential accidents and incidents, even oil spills there. And the Coast Guard is working with our partners to be prepared for those sort of eventualities.
And have you had discussions with administration partners that you can reveal in an unclassified setting about the increasing concerns related to Russia's aggression in Ukraine and how that might have an impact on the Arctic?
Yes, sir. We are absolutely joined. We're a member of the intelligence community, so we get the same intelligence everybody else does. We are joined at the hip at the Department of Defense and the component services and interoperable as a military service with their operations. Absolutely, we're communicating.
What resources or what actions do you think would be helpful for Congress to take to support your work in the Arctic in both ensuring our national security and also making sure that we're taking full advantage of the region?
We ask for Congress's enduring support in our recapitalization, in our shipbuilding, and the shore infrastructure that we need in order to have the kind of presence to provide that strategic deterrence in those locations. So we know we need to build 8 to 9 polar security and medium icebreakers. We know that we need to build out Seattle as a home port. We need to purchase a commercially available icebreaker, and that's in the fiscal year 2024 budget, so we can get after this problem set soon. You know, as a great nation, we really need to be able to respond at the time and place of our desire, and the Coast Guard needs to advance and grow our assets in order to achieve that.
And my last topic that I want to address, and I don't know if Mr. Brzezowski is the best person to answer this, but the Arctic Council was created 25 years ago and has paused because of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. And I'm wondering if you could give an update on what the status of the council is and whether it's resuming its work without Russia.
Is it okay if I take that question,
Yes.
Congressman? So I say this because the Coast Guard supports some of the working groups under the Arctic Council with the State Department leading. So the Arctic Council resumed its convenings and its discussions after the chair, Russia had been the chair during the invasion. After they stepped down and Norway took over in May, those discussions in the Arctic Council, absent Russia, have continued. Russia has been permitted by the Arctic Council to participate below the principal level and only in writing, not in meeting attendance.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Excellent question. I now recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Ezell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it's been a great conversation today about the Arctic region and the Coast Guard strategy to secure the area. We know that the Russians and the Chinese are bad actors, and what's going on up there is of great concern of ours. To combat this, you know, we must roll out the next generation of polar security cutters as soon as possible. And I'm proud that the most advanced ice breakers in the world are being built in South Mississippi. Ultimately, these vessels that my constituents are constructing will help secure the Arctic region. Admiral Goche, as we say in South Mississippi, the initial contract for the Polar Security Cutter program was awarded to V.T. Halter in November of 22. V.T. Halter Shipyard was acquired by Bollinger, and they continued the work on the program. Vice Admiral, thank you for visiting there recently. I really appreciate you going by my district. Can you tell us a little bit about the confidence that you may have in our shipyard program down there?
Congressman, to start out, we knew that there were going to be challenges with this acquisition given the novelty and the complexity of this particular ship. Having just been down there, though, with some of our I am not an acquisition guy, but we had our chief acquisition folks there. I think they're encouraged at the actions that the shipyard has taken to accelerate the timeline and to move forward on some of the key things. So it's stuff like we really need to have a detailed design complete before they can begin construction in total. They've made a lot of progress since the shipyard turned ownership over. In order to accelerate the construction of the vessel, the Coast Guard has authorized the construction of some test hull sections, and that gives the shipyard some build proficiency and build some lessons in how they can build the rest of the ship. They built one of those and they're building the second, and I think that's going well. We do have some hurdles. I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture. The shipyard has indicated issues in the contract in terms of the time delivery, which is currently 2025, and the cost. And we're in negotiations with them to understand what the courses of action forward might be.
Very good. I understand that the previous shipyard was owned by a foreign company, which owned it, which required some additional oversight in the operations. Are you finding it easier to deal with this shipyard that is owned by the Americans versus a foreign company?
My acquisition colleagues would warn me to be very professional because there are rigid rules under the federal acquisition regulations. We treat everybody the same and have the requisite oversight. That being said, we have a long-term relationship with Bollinger. They're building our fast response cutters. They have built almost every modern class of patrol boat that we have in the inventory, and those are high-quality, well-performing ships.
Thank you very much. The Coast Guard testified earlier this year that its mission in the polar regions will require 8 to 9 polar icebreakers, which we've had some discussion about this morning already. This is an increase. Given the new estimate, could you clarify how this breakdowns in terms of class, such as the heavy or medium icebreakers?
Yeah, I think we're doing further analysis to understand just where that break point might be. But I think we're thinking 4 to 5 heavies, 4 to 5 mediums, and it's going to swing one way or the other depending on what our concept of employment, concept of operation looks like. The importance of the mediums is that they get access places where the heavies can't go. Right. And we really expect those to be less expensive, so it'll be a better deal for the taxpayer.
Very good. Given the current absence of the capable polar cutters, to what extent are the national security cutters or the fast response cutters able to operate in the polar regions?
Less so the fast response. Well, I say the polar regions. We are home porting 6 fast response cutters in Alaska. Those will operate in the Gulf of Alaska and Southeast Alaska predominantly. But when we're talking north of Nome, north of the Bering Strait, those won't be operating there. But the national security cutters we have actually brought through the Bering and operated in the Chukchi Sea. We did that on occasion once so we could accompany the Chinese icebreaker Shui Long in there to provide presence along the maritime boundary line. In the summer months when there's no ice, we can operate up there.
Thank you, Vice Admiral. Thank you all for being here today. It's been a great discussion, and we'll continue to do everything we can to support the Coast Guard in your mission. So, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Garcia from California for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate this important hearing, and thank you to all of our witnesses. We know that our nation and our national interests face many threats and challenges, whether it's from competitors like Russia and China, climate change, or changing economic trade, all of which has been talked about today in this hearing. We know that in the Arctic, all these factors and challenges come together in unique ways. President Biden, of course, has adopted a national strategy for the Arctic region and establishing an ambassador at large for the Arctic as well, all very positive steps and moves forward. Now, our Coast Guard is critical in our operations and presence in the region, and so I look forward to our committee working together in a bipartisan way to support their mission. I'll also add that I served 8 years as mayor of Long Beach, and the Coast Guard was just a critical piece and partner to us in every way at our ports and security, even as an economic driver in our city. And so we're very grateful to our Coast Guard and our partnerships back home in Long Beach and in California. Now, we know that we're quickly falling behind both Russia and China, who are really trying to dominate the region and often in collaboration with each other. As Russia modernizes upwards of 50 bases along the Arctic, it continues to build its fleet, of course, as we know, and the Coast Guard, of course, is operating at a reduced level in comparison to clearly these, what I believe are aggressors in the region. We know that new vessels are under construction, but behind schedule and already over budget. This is concerning to all of us. But we know it's not enough also just to count holes. Every vessel needs complicated infrastructure and trained personnel to support deployments. Admiral, I just want to, just first to you, from various reporting, it seems that not only are Russia and China both investing heavily to control the region, but their partnership and collaboration continues to increase. So what are we doing to try to increase our presence and really focusing on this collaboration? Because I think it's a collaboration that's especially concerning.
Yeah, you said two key words, Congressman, that's presence and collaboration. And so we've been talking about fielding more capabilities to provide that persistent presence that we need in order to counter any kind of malicious behaviors that we, in that particular region. Our plans in expanding our fleet, our plans hopefully to get a medium icebreaker purchased here in the '24 budget are part of that. But really key here are the partnerships of like-minded nations through the Arctic Council, through the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum Atlantic. You can tell we have a number of venues in the United States Coast Guard, and both on the policy side and operationally, that really strengthens the resolve and the relationships between these countries against the kind of malicious behaviors that we might encounter.
And can you also just walk us through more broadly what the U.S. stands to lose from like a national security perspective if Russia and China consolidate and essentially try to box us out of the Arctic?
Well, a lot. I mean, it's really challenging to contemplate. I mean, we are talking Alaska here. We're talking the Arctic. Our U.S. is an Arctic state. So to kind of be boxed out of our own neighborhood is really a scary thing to be thinking about. In the broader Arctic, similarly, the Arctic historically has just been inaccessible, and now that it's becoming more accessible, we absolutely need to make sure that it's free, open, peaceful, and benefits everyone.
And finally, Admiral, so again, as former mayor, the Long Beach and Los Angeles ports is the largest container seaports in the United States, critical ports to the rest of the country. There are also ports in the Arctic. And so what we know is that the encroachment's happening, of course, all across the Arctic, but especially also nearing ports in the Arctic. And so what are the impacts or concerns we have related around ports and our interests around trade and having these ports, having these ports operational as far as we see them from both a national security perspective and an economic perspective?
Yeah, thanks. And I know that port, the California port complex as well. I was the operational commander overall Coast Guard operations in California. So port security and assuring the maritime transportation system for the Coast Guard, other than search and rescue, is absolutely preeminent for us. And so when we look at U.S. infrastructure in the area, certainly the port of Anchorage is the preeminent port there. The Coast Guard has a sector, Western Alaska, headquartered out of there. And that is their number one job, to preserve that as sort of the entree into the remainder of the state by road or by other means. But when we talk about other port infrastructure, it's just notable how much investment that Russia is doing along their Arctic coast. They've announced their intent the Northern Sea Route, the waterway there that brings goods and services through the Bering Straits from Russia, they've announced their intent to have that operational now year-round. They are going to employ icebreakers to help do that, but that tells you what the importance is to their economic and national security on the Arctic.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. D'Esposito, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. In addition to serving on the House Homeland Security Committee, I also have the honor of serving on Transportation and Infrastructure. Acting Assistant Secretary Brzezowski, Homeland Security plays a vital role in securing the transportation sector in the United States of America. This includes airports, marine ports, maritime ports, those that facilitate the flow of goods and people across this world, as well as oil, gas pipelines, and freight rail networks. Can you describe the posture of DHS equities in protecting the infrastructure that supports life in the American Arctic?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. I was chomping at the bit almost to jump in on the last question because that infrastructure, beyond sort of the very visible port infrastructure that we see in sort of big maritime facilities, is just so vital. Even just in Alaska, we're looking at, of course, a big infrastructure in maritime ports like the Port of Alaska, but also airports that are also a very visible presence, and then the things that you may not see but are indispensable to the transportation, but also other types of energy and networks in Alaska and basically to the rest of the United States. Things like undersea cables, where you see 98% of the world's internet and other types of communications are not in that region, but sort of in those undersea cables where you see them running through that region. And also things like the Arctic Trans-Alaska Pipeline, which is a 800-mile network that provides fuel, gas, other types of energy resources, not only to the region, but to the continental United States. So our posture in the region is going to be sort of spanning the totality of the DHS mission set. Maybe I'll group it best into the authorities that we have for preparing and engaging with stakeholders. These are where we have our transportation security officials working with state and local on putting in place regulatory and non-regulatory regimes for security, all the way down to the physical presence and the law enforcement that you see through Coast Guard and Customs and TSA, and then spanning into the response and recovery that you see through FEMA.
Okay, thank you. And obviously, I know we've discussed, and there's been questions asked, that Alaska and the Arctic, they present a unique operating environment, and they present unique threats. And it's clear that the administration has failed to make sure that we have what we need to protect our homeland in other places throughout this country. Are you confident and in the department that it has what it needs to protect the homeland in those regions?
Thank you so much. It is our #1 priority to ensure that we are protecting not only those regions, but the regions throughout the United States. The diversity of, as I said, the missions, as well as the authorities and the expertise that span DHS, we're constantly working to enhance those and improve those. I would say in the Arctic region, as we're looking at these critical infrastructures that you mentioned, again, that the ports and then some of these supporting critical infrastructures that are indispensable to energy networks, transportation networks, health and safety networks, we're aggressively employing the tools that we have in the entities, both people presence as well as the partnerships and other types of capabilities.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Menendez, the gentleman from New Jersey, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, thank you for convening today's hearing on U.S. Arctic strategy. To our witnesses, thank you for being here. I want to build on the questions my colleagues have asked throughout today's hearing on the new polar security cutters that the Coast Guard is procuring. While I'm concerned about the delays that have plagued the process so far, I want to talk about what comes next once those vessels are built, keeping them operational. In a challenging environment like the Arctic, I want to be sure that our polar security cutters are able to receive timely service and repairs. Admiral, how is the Coast Guard accounting for future maintenance needs in the design process of the new polar security cutters?
Congressman, when we start the program, we basically bake that into the overall cost. We have a life cycle cost analysis that we do that includes things like the regular operation and maintenance, but also the depot level maintenance in terms of dry dockings and things like that.
Appreciate that. And just to follow up on that, one thing I want to make sure we are all considering is the infrastructure afforded by current shipyards. For example, as a point of personal pride, in New Jersey's 8th Congressional District, we have the Bayonne Dry Dock, the largest dry dock in the nation, which received a small shipyard grant earlier this year to improve their technology and infrastructure, allowing them to continue providing crucial repair services to vessels in the U.S. Armed Services. Admiral, what is the Coast Guard doing to ensure that our current ship repair facilities will be able to meet the needs of the new polar security cutters?
Yeah, great question. The U.S. Defense Industrial Shipyard Base is absolutely crucial, not just to the Coast Guard, but the United States Navy, NOAA, and other governmental entities. So having the kind of facilities that are there in order to conduct not just the shipbuilding, but the dry docking and the long-term maintenance is absolutely crucial. We don't have a heck of a lot of resilience in that regard, I have to say. And what I'll cite here is that Secretary Del Toro, Secretary of Navy, has been very forthright in this, in announcing a government shipbuilding council. That announcement was made at U.S. Coast Guard Yard in Baltimore, Maryland. So that tells you, number one, that we are very tightly integrated with the Navy in this particular problem set. And number two, we would benefit from more capacity and capability there.
Absolutely, and I had a chance to visit Bayonne Dry Dock with the Secretary, and so continuing further collaboration to ensure that we have that capacity, have the resiliency. Just one last question to build off of that. I'm curious to hear our witnesses' thoughts on how increased maritime activity in the Arctic will increase demands on our ship repair facilities. This question is open to any of our witnesses. How are we incorporating the demands for repairs from both defense and commercial vessels operating in the Arctic in our strategic planning? Open for any witness.
Congressman, so maybe amplifying the earlier answer, there are just a certain number of dry docks that are going to be able to handle the Polar Security Cutter. It is an extraordinarily heavy vessel. It's the largest ship that the Coast Guard will ever has had to date in the inventory. So there are just a few shipyards that can handle that. And quite frankly, we would be in direct competition with the United States Navy on the dry docking of their hulls as well, which is why we coordinate with the Navy in order to try to deconflict those sorts of maintenance periods. Having more options, having more resilience in that shipyard, in the suite of shipyard capabilities would only be beneficial.
I agree, and that was just in competition with the Navy. You also have you will see increased commercial activity there as well, which will be an additional burden on our existing dry dock facility. So look forward, again, to working with you on that. In the remaining time, building off my colleague, Representative Goldman's line of questioning, I want to make sure we are prepared for the potential consequences of increased Russian-Chinese cooperation. I was particularly troubled by reports of Russian tankers without ICE classification shipping oil through the Arctic to China. This question is for any of our witnesses. What actions can the U.S. take to pressure Russia and China to reduce the environmental risk they are posing to the Arctic with these unprepared tankers?
Maybe I'll start off at a strategic level very briefly. One of the sort of wide-ranging actions that our Secretary has recently taken is to initiate what he called a 90-day sprint. And this is to take a really close look at the totality of actions that are arising from this increased activity of the PRC in the area. So the Arctic is one of 6 of the focus areas for this sprint. We're looking at a variety of evolving threats and things like critical infrastructure, increased traffic, protecting our critical infrastructure in the area, and a host of other things. So that is one thing where we're inspecting current processes and evolving threats, and we'll have more information on that early next year about some of those specific findings.
I appreciate that. And as we think about that increased activities, just making sure that we're prepared to hold both nations accountable should a catastrophe happen in the Arctic. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you so much.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Burkeen of the great state of Oklahoma for his 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you all being here. And probably this is going to be unfair because I'm going to lay before you the holistic approach of spending for our nation. And I'm doing that because, as we stand before, a nation that is facing within the next 10 years insolvency on mandatory programming and in our discretionary spending, which you all are a part of, 100% of our discretionary spending right now is borrowed money. We had a $1.7 trillion gross national deficit as of last year, and that was our total spend for discretionary spending. So every dollar we're spending, inclusive of the budget for the Coast Guard and so many other things because of mismanagement of finances for the last 40 years, probably more so than any other time in our nation's history, we don't ask the questions anymore, how do we pay for this? So how do we pay for $3 billion worth of icebreakers when it's borrowed money from our kids and our grandkids? And can you make a strong case, with what's happening with our southern border? And I think we spent under the Trump administration for 400 miles of rehabbing of border wall security. It cost $15 billion. So almost $3 billion for these icebreakers is a significant amount of money in comparison to what we could do to secure our southern border. So I guess what I'm doing is help make a case with a nation that never talks about how we pay for this. How do we pay for this? And make the case for why is it such a high priority?
Yeah, Congressman, I acknowledge the deep relevance of your question. My response is the Coast Guard is actually an investment. When we look at only costs, it sort of masks the fact that in every day the Coast Guard actually saves the nation money. When I was captain of the Port of New Orleans and we had something bad happen on the Mississippi River and I closed the river down, it was $270 million in lost revenue to business for every day that river was shut down. And I think as we are going to see more cruise ships operating, more deep draft cargo vessels, including oil and liquefied natural gas vessels operating in the high Arctic, including eventually the transpolar route over the North Pole, perhaps, mitigating those types of accidents is actually going to be a cost saver for us. And then when we look at the geostrategic impacts of additional presence by Russia, additional presence by China, what costs are we deferring that we're then going to have to pay in the long term? The Coast Guard has actually been advocating for polar capabilities for the past 20 years. These costs have been deferred.
And so if I could just take it further, is there not any way, I know you have the Healy, correct, that is a medium-sized icebreaker, and I'm not for sure about the other total assets. Tell me, what happens if within another 5 to 10 years after a major investment, things start changing and we start seeing these routes are no longer possible any longer? I mean, it wasn't so long ago that these routes weren't possible just because of, and what happens if a freeze can, reinitiates there? And we had this investment and now things go the opposite direction. What, can we not make do with what we have and without it being an impediment to us?
Wherever there's going to be ice, we're going to need an ice-breaking capability to give access to the places that we need to go to provide Coast Guard services. And, thinking about your last question, our one heavy icebreaker was built in 1976. I think that's pretty darn good value for the buck. The Coast Guard is doing a 5-year service life extension plan in little chunks during the summer months so that that icebreaker can travel down to Antarctica in the winter to do its job.
And I come from a heavy equipment world where some of my best machinery was old machinery if you take good care of it. So you are indicating that there is some means of expanding the lifespan. Have you looked at beyond 5 years and maybe, taking this equipment and expanding the lifespan beyond that time frame?
Well, actually, so that ship goes into the yard for a period of months, once a year, and will for 5 years. We're 3 years in, and that's very successful at this point. That will extend the service life of the Coast Guard cutter Polar Star until the first Polar Security cutter is going to be in service. So that ship will be with us for a while.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Titus from Nevada for her 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. In Nevada, we have a number of native tribes who are very much engaged in the culture, the politics, the economics, and just recently, they were very involved in having Aviklame declared a national monument. I know there are a number of tribes in Alaska that you have worked with, Ms. Brzezowski, and I think within the Department of Homeland Security, we have a Tribal Homeland Security Advisory Council. Can you tell me how much they've been engaged in setting policy in the Arctic, and if you think they may become kind of a permanent voice in the Arctic Council?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. And I have to actually give credit to my colleagues. I'm new on the job, so all the good work goes to the folks that have been here much longer than I have. But you're absolutely right. The establishment of the Homeland Security Tribal Advisory Council, which does include 2 of the 15 members coming from the Alaskan region, is one of many advisory councils that the Department of Homeland Security, but other government agencies have. In particular, that group was indispensable in providing input and insight into the development of the DHS implementation plan that we're going to be using to guide our implementation of the national strategy for the Arctic region. So it's not a body in name only, but rather really providing key insights into the needs of the community, things that need to be prioritized, as well as livelihoods and sort of priorities of those communities. I also did want to note here that we're with 40% of all federally recognized tribes, as I understand it, being in Alaska, a physical presence in that area is indispensable. My team actually folks from my team had traveled to the region earlier this year to get a sense of the community needs and requirements as we develop this implementation plan, which is in the final stages. I want to also give credit to our Federal Emergency Management Agency. Not only are they integrated into communities around the world, but in Alaska in particular. Looking down to make sure I get their name right, but they actually have developed and recently released a national tribal strategy, which is a strategic roadmap to better help tribal nations to prepare for and then respond to emergencies. That's not specific to Alaska, but again, worldwide. And then also last year, President Biden appointed an enrolled citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma as FEMA's very first national tribal advocate. So sort of incorporating these viewpoints from the top down and baking them into the policies that will guide our actions is something that we're very committed to.
Admiral, do you consult with the tribes as you build out the infrastructure needed?
Yes, ma'am. We consult with tribes. It's just an everyday course of business, and it is not by exception. It's routine. An example of that is we have this standing operation called Arctic Shield in Alaska, which is another way of saying how we deliver Coast Guard services throughout Alaska. And just in this calendar year, we've reached 91 different communities, many of them tribal, in remote locations in Alaska to do things like commercial fishing vessel safety inspections, training and education on boating safety. We'll inspect oil tanks in those communities that they use to run their infrastructure to make sure that they're in good shape and they won't leak. Right now, actually, we are in the process of looking at shipping lanes across the north coast of Alaska, and those are in direct consultation with tribal communities.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that involvement. It's another area where I think you can find needed involvement is, you mentioned that more and more traffic is in the Arctic. You got more tourists, you got more business, you got more defense. When people come, they leave trash. What are y'all doing about protecting this area from being trashed?
In terms of international shipping, the Coast Guard works very closely through the International Maritime Organization. They're actually meeting in London right now to set a high standard for vessels to prevent trash, to prevent oil discharge. And in fact, just a few years ago, under the Coast Guard's leadership, we advanced something called the Polar Code, which are special shipping regulations which prevent things like overboard discharge of gray water to make sure that we maintain a pristine Arctic environment.
Plastic, keep plastic out.
And plastic as well, absolutely.
You want to add to that? Or? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentlelady yields, and appreciate those questions. I now yield to Mr. Crane, the gentleman from Arizona, for his 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to say thank you to the panel for showing up today. Appreciate all the information that you're bringing to this committee on challenges in the Arctic. I want to start with you, Admiral. What are your greatest concerns in your observations of the activity, the collaboration with Russia and China in the Arctic region?
So the greatest concern is that we know how Russia and China behave outside of the Arctic, and that sort of behavior might be imported inside the Arctic. I mean, to date, China has access through their icebreakers, and they're doing scientific examinations there. And but you know, as we see fishing stocks moving forward, as we see it more attractive to do resource exploitation there, the challenge that we have is that we'll see similar behaviors from China and Russia that we see elsewhere in the world, which is directly undermining the global norms that we all enjoy.
Yeah, thank you, Admiral. And as a former sailor myself, I just wanted to acknowledge and say thank you for your service. I know you've spent a long time serving this country, and I think I speak for all of us on the panel when we say we appreciate it. I do want to go back into something you were talking about a second ago. You were not only talking about some of the needs that you have for some equipment, like these icebreakers that we've spent a lot of the time talking about, but I also want to talk about something you mentioned, the people that work for you and within the Coast Guard, and some of the recruiting issues that you guys are having. I want to see if, I want to ask your opinion. Why do you think you're, across the military, having so many recruiting issues?
Yeah, so as you said, we share this challenge with the other military services. COVID had a huge impact on things, and it wasn't really until COVID hit that we saw this dip in recruiting and retention for whatever reason. I think, and a lot of this would just be supposition, so I have to be careful, but I think it set us back in terms of individuals wanting to get out there, serving their country, do something that's really challenging. And I think in the Coast Guard, what we suffer from most is exposure. People don't necessarily know who we are, especially young people who want a challenging and rewarding career in the United States military. We're getting after that. We've got a new campaign. We're opening up new recruiting offices. We're expanding our recruiting capacity by 38%. The numbers are starting to come back. So by early indications, we're having some successes.
So you think that COVID is the main reason that the military is having its recruiting issues?
I'm an optimist, sir. You know, you hear these things about the eligibility because of weight and pharmaceuticals and stuff is lower in the average young population, that there isn't this propensity to serve. I hardly disagree. I think there are a lot of great young Americans out there who just don't know about the Coast Guard, that if they knew that we are law enforcement, that we're military, that we clean up the environment, that we serve the American people, I think you know, we'll have a lot more folks coming in.
Thanks, Admiral. To follow up on that, do you think it might have anything to do with what you regularly regularly hear is being described as some of the wokeness within the military, like CRT training, DEI training, drag shows on base, things like that. Do you think that has anything to do with it? And kind of a loss of the focus of what the military is supposed to be about?
You know, I just don't see that in the United States Coast Guard, what you're referring to. And our workforce is the best workforce that I've seen in my 36-year career. The people who are in the Coast Guard today are better than ever before. A lot of them have college educations. A lot of them have had professional careers that want to do something different and better, and that come to us. So I don't think so.
You haven't seen any of that?
No.
You haven't seen a change in the culture of the military? How long have you been in, Admiral?
37 years.
That's, with all due respect, I find that hard to believe, sir. What about vaccine mandates, sir? You know that we lost about 30,000 active duty service members that refused to take the vaccine that are now being asked if they want to come back into the service. What do you think about that?
We welcome them back.
Yeah, I know, but do you think that has anything to do with recruitment efforts? The military is can be a pretty dangerous place to work, right, Admiral?
Yeah, absolutely.
And when I left the military, sir, I was in E6, and I went into some of the most dangerous environments in the world, being in special forces. It was a lot easier for me. It was very easy for me to go into some of those spots knowing that my leadership actually cared about my well-being. But when service members, regardless of whether they're in the Marines, Coast Guard, Navy, et cetera, when they don't believe that their leadership is motivated by their well-being, but they're just, in the case of the vaccines, making them take experimental vaccines, knowing that the survivability rates were about 99.9%, and they didn't see the need for it, that's a problem. And it makes some of these young individuals question whether or not their welfare is going to be looked after, whether or not they're going to start a family and set down roots in a community and then be forced out for something like that. Do you think that has anything to do with the recruiting problem?
Well, Connor,
The chair may declare, thanks. The chair may declare the committee in recess at any point. The purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony on the present and future challenges in the Arctic region and evaluate the United States Coast Guard's unique role in maintaining freedom of movement, defending vital U.S. national interests, and protecting U.S. sovereignty in the region. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. The United States faces a world fraught with peril. We have an unprecedented crisis at our southwest border. Israel, our closest ally in the Middle East, endured the deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust. Russia's ongoing and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine is the largest armed conflict in Europe since World War II. East Asia is on a hair trigger because of the expansionist tendencies of the Chinese Communist Party in the South China Sea. So you might be asking, why is the Committee on Homeland Security having a hearing about the Arctic? In Congress, our daily business is often dictated by the latest disaster or most recent crisis. And to be sure, there are plenty of those. However, during my time in the military and beginning at West Point, of course, I was taught to view the battlefield through a strategic lens and step back from the tactical situation to examine the whole of the operating environment. In this spirit, I believe it is time for the committee to examine the strategic and critical role of the Arctic region. The story of how the United States became an Arctic nation explains why the Arctic matters so much to us. In 1867, Secretary of State William Seward secured a treaty with the Russian Tsar Alexander II for the purchase of Alaska from the Russian Empire for a modest $7.2 million. Many U.S. senators were skeptical of Seward's vision when the treaty arrived in the Senate for ratification. However, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Charles Sumner, ushered the treaty through his committee, helping to secure its ratification. In his research, Sumner realized both the economic potential of Alaska's bountiful natural resources and the territory's strategic geographic position to the shipping routes of Asia. Nearly 7 decades later, the founding father of the United States Air Force, Billy Mitchell, declared in testimony to Congress, and I quote, "I believe that in the future, whoever controls Alaska controls the world. I think it is the most strategic place in the world," end quote. Mitchell's vision for the eventual 49th state proved shrewd. The United States Air Force based early warning radar stations, long-range bombers, and missile defense capabilities in Alaska during the Cold War due to its proximity to the Soviet Union. Passenger airlines also utilized Alaska as the global hub so planes from Western Europe, East Asia, and North America could avoid traveling through restricted Soviet airspace. Today, nearly 150 years since the purchase of Alaska, the world has changed dramatically. Not surprisingly, though, the Alaskan Arctic remains strategically vital to the United States. The airspace in Alaska is the United States' first line of defense against intrusions by aircraft or missiles, as was brazenly reminded earlier this year with the surveillance balloon. U.S. military forces based in Alaska stand ready to deploy quickly to any theater of operations in the world, from Eastern Europe and the Middle East to the Western Pacific. As the sea ice recedes and the waters of the Arctic Ocean become traversable for longer stretches of the year, civilian and military maritime traffic has increased. This trend will only make Alaska even more strategically important to the United States, as Alaska lies at the confluence of the two major shipping routes through the Arctic to East Asia, the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage. Our geopolitical adversaries recognize that control of the Arctic region is essential. Russia, which has the most territory and largest Arctic population, maintains a robust military presence in the region. Russia has 6 icebreakers. The United States currently has 2. Russia's proximity to Alaska makes its concentration of forces appear even more menacing. The Russian mainland lies less than 60 miles away from the west coast of Alaska. Additionally, just 2.4 miles separate the Russian island of Diomede and the American island of Little Diomede in the Bering Strait. To make matters worse, the People's Republic of China has absurdly claimed itself to be, quote, a near-Arctic state, and is attempting to impose its will through diplomatic pressure and increasing maritime transits by PRC vessels in Arctic waters. The PRC is also actively building out its own icebreaker fleet, and its 2 existing icebreakers have operated in both the Arctic and Antarctic regions. Therefore, the United States must prioritize the Arctic as a region of national importance and one that is vital to our homeland security. And this committee has a crucial role to play in securing our strategic interests in the Arctic. The United States Coast Guard has operated in Alaska since the United States purchased the state. Today, with its icebreaker fleet and assets based around Alaska, the Coast Guard is a critical component of the U.S. national security posture in the Arctic, performing search and rescue operations in our austere environments and enforcing U.S. laws in our waters off the coast of Alaska. As maritime traffic increases, we must ensure that the Coast Guard maintains the ability to protect our coastline, enforce our laws, and save lives at sea. The Department of Homeland Security has a responsibility to protect our transportation sector and critical infrastructure from physical and cyber threats. Alaska hosts a multitude of important military bases and critical infrastructure sites such as the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the Port of Alaska, and Ted Stevens International Airport, in addition to several military installations in Alaska and critical undersea cables connecting Alaska to the continental U.S. It is vital that the Department of Homeland Security work to deter potential attacks or attempts by adversaries to degrade or disrupt the operations of this critical infrastructure. Secretary Seward, Senator Sumner, and Colonel Mitchell recognize the enormous potential of Alaska in their time. We must not lose sight of their prescient vision in our time. I thank our witnesses for appearing before the committee today, and I look forward to their testimonies. The purpose of course, our hearing today, as I said, is to address the issues of opportunity and threat that the Arctic region poses. I'm going to defer the ranking member's statements until he arrives, and I would now like to introduce our distinguished panel of witnesses. Questions by members on the dais will be reserved for the witnesses on the second panel after the opening statement from our first panel. Senator Dan Sullivan has represented the state of Alaska since 2015 Senator, thank you for being here today, and I now recognize you for 5 minutes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson. I'm very honored to be able to testify on this important hearing on the Arctic and Arctic strategy. And I commend the committee. To your point, Mr. Chairman, there's a lot going on in the world, but we got to keep our eye on all strategic areas of the globe and America's interests. So I commend the committee for undertaking this hearing to understand the complexities of Arctic security and providing me an opportunity to talk about the increasing significance of the Arctic region to our nation's security. The Arctic, as you mentioned in your excellent opening statement, and by the way, you're going to hear some repetition here because I think it was so good, but the Arctic is undergoing monumental changes. Sea ice is receding, opening an entire ocean that was previously unreachable. This allows access to a wealth of natural resources and makes available maritime trade routes that are thousands of nautical miles shorter than transits using the Suez Canal or Panama Canal. The strategic importance of this region, the Arctic, is unquestionable. Arctic security is American security. Despite that, we as a country are not properly postured to secure our vital national interests in this region. America is an Arctic nation because of Alaska. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciated a little bit of the history on my great state. By the way, $7.2 million, probably the best real estate deal in the history of America. Maybe the Louisiana Purchase, but they're both close. 2 cents an acre. My state is at the forefront of Arctic competition and guards the United States against threats from our competitors. We all know, and you mentioned it, Mr. Chairman, we are in a new era of authoritarian aggression led by the dictators Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. They are running hostile regimes that seek to control access to the Arctic region and, importantly and dangerously, are increasingly working together in the Arctic. Alaska's proximity to both Russia and China requires that my state play a vital role in securing America's interests in the Arctic. You mentioned Billy Mitchell. I never tire. My colleagues on the Armed Services Committee get a little bit tired of the quote, but I'll say it again since you already said it. Billy Mitchell referred to in a hearing in the Congress as Alaska is the most strategic place in the world. Fortunately, we have undertaken a military build-up there that needs to continue. Right now, Alaska constitutes 3 pillars of America's military might. We are the cornerstone of missile defense for the entire country. All the radar systems and all the ground-based missile interceptors are based in Alaska, protecting every city in the United States. We are the hub of air combat power for the Arctic in the Indo-PACOM region. For example, we have over 100 fifth-generation fighters located in Alaska, F-22s and F-35s. There's no place on the planet Earth that has over 100 combat-coded fifth-gen fighters. And to your point, Mr. Chairman, we are the platform for expeditionary forces, including the Army's new 11th Airborne Division that can deploy on a moment's notice anywhere in the entire Northern Hemisphere. But we need to make sure that Alaska becomes the logistical hub for the Arctic, for our power projection in the Arctic. In recent years, the Russian Navy has stepped up the scale of its exercises near Alaska. It is doing all kinds of bear bomber runs at our state. They're so common that they don't even make the news anymore, several already this year. Last year, Russia and China, for the first time, deployed a joint naval task force, 7 ships, to Alaska's waters. We responded. I love the Coast Guard, but we responded with 1 small Coast Guard cutter. I called some of our senior military and Coast Guard leaders saying, look, this is going to continue. If it happens again, we need to show a much stronger, robust approach. You may have read this summer, it happened again. This time 11 Russian and Chinese ships operating off the coast of Alaska. To our military, NORTHCOM and Indo-PACOM's credit, they sent 4 destroyers and P-8s to track this very significant joint Russian Chinese naval task force. But we must make sure that this is a sign of things to come. We not only need more Coast Guard assets, but also a Navy presence back in Alaska. We will need to be able to respond more rapidly in the future to these kind of incursions. Unfortunately, and I love our Department of Defense, the DoD has been asleep at the switch on the Arctic. The leaders on these issues have been the House and the Senate. We have been pressing for provisions in the NDAA, in the Coast Guard bill, year after year to get our Pentagon and, quite frankly, our Coast Guard to focus more on the Arctic. As a matter of fact, right now the NDAA is being marked up. I'm going to hustle back over to the Senate side. It's our conference with the House and the Senate. We have my provision, the Arctic Security Initiative, in this year's NDAA to make sure that we focus on the Arctic. And to your point, Mr. Chairman, the United States has not invested in Arctic infrastructure. The number actually of Russian icebreakers is 54, many of which are nuclear powered. They are weaponized. We have 2 icebreakers, and one is broken. That's what we have. We're building more. We're looking to purchase off the shelf some, but we need to make sure that we are trying to close this very, very significant icebreaker gap. Even China's icebreaking capacity is on pace to surpass ours in 2025. And as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, they're not even an Arctic nation. We recognize the importance of freedom of navigation transits through the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, but we need to do the same for the Northern Sea route from Europe to the Bering Strait. Putin has called this region the new Suez Canal that he will control. We can't let them do that. So I commend the Coast Guard on working to get more icebreakers, commend the Coast Guard cutter Healy that transited near the Northern Sea route near the Russian EEZ for making this difficult and challenging transit. But icebreakers, Mr. Chairman, are only the beginning. The level of infrastructure, domain awareness, reliable comms that are sufficient to support America's security needs in the Arctic are lacking. As I mentioned, Congress has made important progress. We've begun work on a deep water port in Nome, Alaska.